Welcome particularly to the forum members. We have also got some observers today, which is great, and hopefully we'll allow ourselves plenty of time for discussion during the period of up to an hour and a half. My name, for those who don't know me, is Patrick Downs, and I run my own business called Trust in Property, which is very much involved in property portfolio owners and also land development. So we're constantly looking at new projects with existing buildings, as well as new projects with new build as well. So the subject of sustainability and making property fit for purpose is very much on everybody's minds these days, particularly landlords and property owners. So we've really got to start thinking heavily in our professions about how we improve the way in which we go about property. Thank you to the panel, 4 members of the panel this morning: Paul Fong of Ridge, David Jones of Evans Jones, Peter Barrett from Gloucestershire Science and Technology Park at Berkeley, and Elle George of Totally Modular. Thank you for your time putting something together, and they'll each introduce themselves a little bit more when they come to 4 subjects today, which will about 20 minutes each, but mainly of discussion rather than presentation. Thank you to Jill Smith for setting us up. Thank you, Jill, and also for keeping us under control, hopefully, over the next hour and a half. The session, unless there's any objections, will be recorded, so we'll all be able to get access to it later once edited. There is a chat box available that is public rather than private, so any other chat going on, or if you want to put any questions together, please put them across the chat box. But I do hope that the forum will be quite open, where people can ask questions as we go along, or just make statements or comments as you wish, really. So it'll be a very open forum, hopefully, and screenshots will be taken, and obviously the usual social media can be used really there afterwards. So please feel free to ask questions. Hopefully you know the hand that you can put up on the Zoom system, but also if you just wave at me, I'll hopefully spot you and make sure that I can bring you in with the appropriate question at the appropriate time, and hopefully the 4 panel members will be watching out for you as well. So I won't dwell any more other than to make those intros, and thank you all once again. And really, over to you, Paul Fong, to get us started.
Right, thank you, Patrick. Sorry, my name's Paul Fong. I am a planner, and I work for Ridge. I'm a partner at Ridge and Company, and I'm based in Cheltenham. I've been doing planning for the last 30-odd years. So I'm going to just kick off. We're talking really today about sustainability in the built environment, how we create sustainable buildings, and how we are going to create a more sustainable future for Gloucestershire and the UK. So firstly, we've got to ask ourselves why we are doing this, and what is the point of getting sustainable buildings anyhow, because we're all living and working very happily. Well, the main reason we're doing this is because there is currently a climate change emergency upon us, and I think every nation has now recognised this, and we need to do something about it. We need to preserve our own world for the future, and give our children a future as well. The development industry does have a role to play, and it's undoubtable that if we can change our building and social habits, then we will be able to make a marked change in the climate change agenda. If we do nothing, it's quite clear that if we continue to burn fossil fuels and the like, then by the year 2100, temperatures will rise by another 4 degrees, which will mean a lot of catastrophic events will occur. There will be a range of rising temperatures, changes in precipitation patterns, more droughts, more heat waves, more extreme weather patterns, rising sea levels, and melting of the Arctic caps. We're already experiencing that, so it is now an opportunity for the development industry to respond to it. So what are we doing in the UK? Well, in 2019, the government produced the climate change agenda, and effectively what they would like us to do is to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. For me, that seems a little way down the tracks, and I think we could probably do a little better if we tried. So let's see what we can do about that. I think the speakers today will help us get through that. Now, Gloucestershire itself, let's just concentrate on Gloucestershire for the time being, has also produced climate change agenda, and they produced that in December 2019. What they would like us to do is to try and get to a position where we are reducing carbon emissions by 80% by 2030, and then carbon zero by 2050. So it's a tall order. I think we can do it. And they've identified that there are a number of things that are important to do that. And one is transportation, because that creates 35% of our emissions. Domestic use is 31%, and then industry and commerce is about 35% of those emissions. So we've got to concentrate on those areas and see how we can do things differently. So it's all about how we create modal shift in transportation, take away fossil fuels from our domestic living, and in industry and commerce, try and reduce fossil fuels and reutilize and make better some of the buildings that we are currently designing. Is that achievable? Well, I would have to say that yes, it is. The difficulties we have is that for our construction industry, there aren't any set rules presently, and that really makes an unequal playing field. And if you're down in, let's say, Berkshire, and you're creating great wealth by building ordinary buildings, why should we do it here in Gloucestershire? Because it adds cost. Well, the government's idea is that actually we can capitalise upon making greener and better buildings. And the green energy business is something that we should now prioritise, because we will turn the corner eventually, and we will have to be at the forefront of that. Gloucestershire is very good at this, by the way, and we have some very, very innovative and entrepreneurial businesses that will allow that that change to happen. We've got some interesting developments coming through that will also prioritise that. We must use those as exemplars. But what are we doing locally? Well, firstly, at a high level, the NPPF Para 148 does identify that there is a need to change our building industry. It hasn't gone through to become a statute at the present time. It's just a recommendation. So we do need laws that will help us do that. But below that, we are now seeing, obviously, the climate change agenda from the county. But to push innovation a little further, I don't know if many of you are aware that the submission version of the Stroud District Local Plan has come out. And that now actually has a policy, DCP1, which seeks for carbon neutral by 2030 in the district. And it targets developments by challenging them to become carbon neutral. So there is becoming a veiled tier of policy that we will all have to apply to shortly, and we will have to adhere to that and make sure our buildings, our developments are green for the future. So we are now beginning to get policy that we will have to apply to. So what are we going to do? Reutilization versus new build. Why would we want to reuse a building when it's going to be a lot quicker to demolish a building and create something new and more sustainable? Well, if we think about our building patterns, we're going to really need to design and build buildings which are more flexible in the future. But a reutilization of existing assets is far more sustainable and far less wasteful than really rolling out a whole tier of new buildings. There is an element of cost, we appreciate that, but actually using that existing fabric is much more important. That's why we've now got a tier of permitted development rights throughout the country, which allow us to change office buildings into residentials, barns into residentials, because the government recognises that this is a far more sustainable way of creating new uses in old buildings rather than just building new all the time. And if you look at the conversions in relation to houses, we've basically got around about between 18 to 20,000 new buildings, new homes through the conversion. So it is far more sustainable if we can reuse our buildings. But if we are going to build new, then we should look at future trends as well, because what we have presently, we are designing for single purpose buildings, and what we're noticing now is that we're going through rapid change. The pandemic has brought upon rapid change. We've essentially condensed 10 years of rapid change into about 18 months. And what we've seen there is more people working from home, offices transforming, the high street has transformed, and we've got a whole host of empty units on the high street, and we're now trying to repurpose a lot of office buildings. So what we need to think about as a group is what we do and how we design for the future. Firstly, we've got the climate change agenda. We will be using no fossil fuels in the future, so we're going to have to adapt to that. We should be locating our buildings where we don't have to create mass travel and indeed keep people in one location so that there is a genuinely mixed-use community in that location. But also think about our high streets. Those units there need to think about whether we can repurpose them for other uses such as social, residential and other commercial uses, and make sure that their shells are available for such uses in the future as well. So there's a range of thoughts there for designing for the future and how we go about that, but making sure that our planning system is flexible and adaptable to accommodate that at the same time, so that we can actually embrace a sustainable future. Patrick, those are a few ideas that I've laid out there.
Thanks, Paul. So we're in the hands of the planners, are we? Would you say?
We're in the hands of government to some extent. The planners are slightly strapped by the fact that they have local plans that are already there. Planning policy is difficult to respond quick enough. The JCS took about 8 years to complete, so you can imagine that trying to adapt to rapid change in a local plan is difficult. But we do need to have flexible policies. We do need to start with government, and we do need to make sure that there's a uniform policy requirement across the board in the United Kingdom.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Any comments or anybody want to add observations? Pete, I see a hand up, so carry on. Any other hands, please put them up. Pete.
Just wondering, if Paul says we've had the change already over the last 18 months, I wonder if that's really the case, because most occupiers haven't really got to grips with their staff coming back, what their office will look like, and whether the real change is going to be over the next 6 months or so as people really start to grapple with what their business needs, particularly in commercial space going forward, or whether we think we've already seen most of that. Certainly on the high street, it's probably crystallised. I think in office buildings, it may yet to come.
Is anybody slow to go back to office still, or people tending to find that they're all rushing back, and it's, you know, there's a feeling that we're trying to get back to business as normal? What's the feeling generally on that point that Pete's made?
I think it's pretty varied across the country, actually. I think in Cheltenham, certainly my experience is that people are eager to get back. I think in London it's very different. I think the concept of spending time on a packed tube is less enamouring for workers in London. But I think in Cheltenham and the likes, and certainly in my office, I've seen a will to want to get back into the office. I don't know how others are finding it.
And so does this delay the sustainability agenda, do we think, in the way that Pete's sort of suggesting it might? Russell?
Oh, sorry, I was just saying I'm finding different firms are doing different things. It very much depends on the company and the culture of the company. Companies which were doing distributed working from home prior to the academic seem to be, prior to the pandemic, seem to be carrying on that way and more adapting. And ones which were more office based beforehand seem to be back in the office and working as normal. So it depends on the culture of the company and the industry and the sort of mix of the company rather than just location. That's what I'm finding from my companies I deal with.
We're certainly working with a number of office occupiers who are replanning their office space within Gloucestershire. and planning for a very different working environment, more breakout spaces, more informal meeting spaces, smaller informal meeting rooms. So occupancy levels are certainly decreasing compared to pre-COVID levels. And in fact, we are looking to increase office space for a company who don't necessarily intend to increase the headcount. So, that has quite an impact upon sort of commercial aspect of rental yields potentially. If the same office space doesn't occupy the same number of bums on seats effectively.
I think a lot of the things that were going on but we didn't really utilise, like breakout areas and hot desking, we've almost been going to be forced into, we've allowed ourselves to be forced into them more perhaps. But I'm just trying to bring it back really to what Paul was saying and Pete was questioning, was whether or not this alters the sustainability agenda or speed or anything. I don't know if there's any views on that.
I think we taking all those collective thoughts on board. I think we are going to experience, and Peter's absolutely correct, that the changes will happen have happened and will happen over the next 6 months. I think the office, people's lifestyles will change, and people will want the flexibility to work in an office and work from home at the same time. To do that, we've really got to repurpose our offices. We've got to have space for meetings. We've got to have a little bit of breakout space. We've got to have space for the younger staff. But we've also got to allow them the flexibility to work from home and create the lifestyles that most people have enjoyed over the last 18 months.
And what about the view that if everybody's half their time working from home and half in the office, from a sustainability point of view, everybody's heating their houses these days and the office all at the same time. So are we not using more energy?
Depends on your house, because if you, my home's got MVHR, so we have to heat it all the time anyway. So by having less office buildings being occupied, then it's more sustainable because there's less office space. But lots of other houses would probably only be heated during the times in which they're occupied, and then you're right that the more spaces are being heated, so it's less sustainable.
It's something that was sort of escapes us, isn't it, in terms of our thought process on sustainability.
I think Paul made a good point though about the buildings, reusing existing buildings, and Carl Elefanti said that the greenest building is one that already exists. So it's important that we do reuse the buildings that we've got, but what we need to avoid is the allowance of offices being converted to homes and that not being completed properly and people living in poor living conditions, because the planning system currently kind of allows offices to be converted without proper regulations in place to make sure that there's enough space and that there's adequate ventilation and things like that.
Yeah. Any other comments or questions on this subject and some of the things that Paul was saying? Anybody there want to sort of add to this? I can't see anybody.
I think it'd be an interesting study to see, and I think Joe made the comment in the chat that whether the people working from home and not jumping in their cars and not causing pollution that way is offset by perhaps using more energy within the home. I don't know the answer to that, but certainly there's a body of work that would be useful to understand there. Certainly in terms of pollution and air quality, we certainly saw improvements during the early stages of the lockdown. But it'd be useful to have some empirical data to see exactly where that lay in terms of its overall impact.
Steve McPherson.
Yeah, just Steve McPherson from Bloor Homes. But the point about reusing existing offices that are currently redundant for residential is an interesting one, because whilst they are often located in central locations and argue sustainable locations, the point Ellie made is a good one, in that the quality and the wider implications for infrastructure aren't particularly being met through the planning system as they normally would. So you've got essentially a building control process which is focused really on means of escape and fire regulation, but beyond that it's not looking at sense of place, public open space, play facilities, and there have been a couple of absolutely shocking examples which have ultimately almost turned into HMOs, with sort of individual offices literally being fitted out with a blind shared communal facilities, which are really poor quality residential environments. So there needs to be a balance, I think. I don't think you can just flip to a planning system which says the reuse of the buildings is fine, subject to means of fire escape. I think it's a much wider encompassing issue there about social integration, the infrastructure that's provided. Because, you know, living on a remote business park on the edge of Reading is not an ideal residential environment for someone, and not particularly good town planning either.
Steve, can I just on the development side? But if we're looking at a carless development, a strategic development with carless houses, is that putting a much greater square footage on the overall development for office space, individual offices in houses? Is that starting to show in some of these schemes?
It is. I mean, from a new build residential perspective, you know, with the global pandemic, it's almost sort of unrecognisable to the house building industry, because, you know, it has been absolute foot to the floor almost for the entire pandemic. And there's a range of reasons for that, but one of the big reasons essentially is a lot of people either have refurbished their properties and look to perhaps get them on the market, but that idea of a room that actually can convert well to an office, so that, you know, traditionally the spare bedroom, we've been working at Bloors on designing smaller house types with home working facilities, and it's something I mentioned in the LEP meeting last week, where traditionally you needed really to own a 4-bed, sort of typically a 4-bed detached house, to have that spare office sort of home working environment. And a lot of the planning policies now, based on SHMA and affordability, are requiring smaller houses. So that Paul made a point about adaptable and flexible spaces. So perhaps, you know, more compact 3-bedroom houses, but the 3rd bedroom, which could traditionally have been perhaps just a nursery or a single bedroom, showing that as a workspace, and providing the electrical layout for, you know, computer and internet connection. You know, it's an interesting point about the balance between, and we've seen it in our business. We're a traditional with a capital T sort of business, with you know, owner driver kind of business, and, you know, the home working concept actually has been quite challenging, but it's been very successful ultimately, because we've been forced into that position, as Paul said. So, you know, when we've had 95% of staff working from home and the business has been operating well and successfully, it's been a bit of an education for some of those slightly longer in the tooth with a more traditional approach to the office-based work, to see how that can really work. But it's a difficult challenge, because the floor space and running an office and keeping an office open, but if it's only half occupied because half of your staff are choosing to stay at home, that's a really difficult balance to strike as well.
Yeah.
So
Paul, did you want to come back on that point, or is that gone?
Yeah, look, there's plenty of complexities about changing buildings into new uses, but I think the core of the thing is reutilization of these buildings, because as Ellie said, it is probably the most sustainable form of development, because you have an existing fabric there. And there are many old buildings which have been converted, and it's not just for residential. I accept everything that's saying about residential standards, but we've got to find a home for these old buildings, and the planning system has to remain flexible to that. I marvel at some of the wonderful new offices that we're getting out of barn conversions, and I think that is probably a good reuse of buildings.
Yeah.
Equally, they go for residential. And people are now wanting the lifestyle, the environment, rather than having to work in places like London and various other places. So we've got to accommodate that, and our building designs must be flexible enough to do that, because within old buildings we've got to build a sustainable interior, i.e. making sure that the fabric is such that we can address the climate change agenda as well.
Okay. Thank you, Paul. David, I'm going to ask you to intro some more to the debate or the discussion, please. So if you could give us your thoughts.
Thank you, Patrick. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is David Jones. I'm Managing Director of Evans Jones, head office in Cheltenham, but operating also from Reading and London, we're a multidisciplinary practice, so planning, building consultancy, project management, and disabled access consultancy. So across a fairly broad range there, and we do deal with projects from inception right through to build out and completion. So it's quite nice to see a project right through the various stages and the various sort of controls that are imposed on developers. So I think Paul gave a really good sort of assessment of where planning is to a degree. I'll look at sort of what's coming down the tracks a little, and what developers may expect. I think as a precursor to that, I would say that planning can only do so much. I think some controls are laid at the door of planners, probably unreasonably. I think it is a little bit of a sort of a blunt instrument, if I could put it that way, to control some of these measures, which would be perhaps better engrossed in building regulations, from my own personal view. But let's have a look at where we are. So sustainability, obviously, there are all, and this is part of the confusion in this agenda, that there are lots of competing definitions for similar things, really. Sustainability, net zero, net carbon neutral. They can often mean different things to different people. Central government had a go within the National Planning Policy Framework 2012 at giving a definition of sustainability, which is really fairly weak. So that had sort of 3 pillars: economic, social, and environmental, and that's followed through in the later revisions to the framework. But that really is only the start of it, and doesn't really address the climate change emergency which is before us now. Paul touched on the climate change emergency. Certainly, I think virtually every local authority and county council within England have now signed up to the climate change emergency and are evolving policies to try and deal with that. The problem, as Paul alluded, that the issue is that policy does respond very, very slowly. So developers who perhaps are resistant to change will try and cite the lack of policy as a reason for not doing anything, which is why it may be better delivered via perhaps other mechanisms. Alongside that, we have the environmental bill. So that's at the report stage in the House of Commons. So what we see coming with that is the spectre of biology net gains on site or off-site payments in lieu of, potentially, which I think all of that is embroiled within the sustainability agenda. So it's not just about saving energy; it's also about planting trees, ecology, biology, etc. And the environmental bill certainly makes that front and centre of what we can see coming down the tracks. I'm seeing appeal inspectors already apply a requirement for a 10% net gain on site. I've recently dealt with the new secondary school in Leckhampton, a local authority school promoted by the Education Authority. There we were required to try and achieve a net gain on site, not 10%, but on a 6-hectare school site, we had to allocate 3 hectares of off-site land to deal with the biology net gain requirements associated with that development. So you start, computing that through other forms of development, and it is going to have a significant impact. As I mentioned, there are payments that can be made for to offset through payment rather than on-site provision, both in terms of biology net gain and meeting your carbon neutral and zero carbon requirements, with carbon offsetting, and very much the ethos of that is that the money collected through that offsetting is then used to upgrade the existing sort of building stock. So I think if that were to be achieved, and there probably is a big if as to whether that particular form of perhaps taxation, as many developers would see it, is actually recycled back to the right source. You know, bear in mind that most of our buildings in this country are existing, but the number of new buildings added per annum is a tiny proportion of the whole. So, as others have said around the table here, we need to look at those existing buildings if we're to make any, you know, significant inroads into meeting the sustainability objectives set out. In my title, I also mentioned the London plan, and people may be thinking, well, why on earth are you mentioning a London plan in a Gloucestershire business show? Fair comment. I mention it because I've seen over the years what starts in London gradually filters out to the shires, and certainly with the new London plan adopted in March 2021, you know, that is having a go, and you know, has some specific policies on energy efficiency and BREEAM and net carbon technologies, whole life cycle costing. So it's not just looking at the building at the point of handover, at the point of practical completion, but also looking at it through its whole life cycle. I think it's fair to say that the London plan was fairly significantly watered down prior to adoption, which that is a bit of an issue. I think we have previously been through in the residential market the Code for Sustainable Homes, which was ultimately cancelled. So, elements which have attempted to address these matters have, by successive governments subsequently been withdrawn. So there is something of a disconnect, and I think it needs probably a braver government to see that falls through. In terms of the London plan, I'm now seeing London boroughs adopt that and take it forward. I'm doing a project in Ealing at the moment where the minimum requirement for commercial buildings is BREEAM excellent, with an aspiration to achieve outstanding. Now, if developers are approaching schemes unaware of that is excellent is a big ask, and if they don't address it at the very onset, then they will have issues trying to achieve those targets. And obviously, BREEAM is pretty far-reaching, covering energy, health and well-being, innovation, land use, materials management, etc., etc. So unless developers are grasping this very early on, they will potentially struggle. So early engagement with appropriate consultants, and I think we will see certainly the BREEAM requirements rolled out, and obviously we're seeing Stroud District Council being an early adopter really locally in seeking to improve the efficiency of buildings, but also with the biology net gain provisions coming through the environmental bill, those will require very, very early assessment to avoid all sorts of problems later on down the track. So that's probably it from me, just giving an indication of what is coming. I think we will see many local authorities across the country adopt what is coming out of London, seek to address the climate change emergency in all sorts of different ways. And as I say, we are seeing inspectors already adopt that, even where there isn't necessarily any policy support for it. So an interesting change, and certainly the government are setting out their stall, even if their track record on issues of this nature is particular. Thank you, Patrick.
Thanks, David. Nice little bit of sound at the end there. I suppose any questions immediately there, or comments that people want to add to? I'm thinking of cost of all these requirements, and what's the extra cost of build or conversion because of these requirements. So any thoughts and comments at all? I'm looking across the board. Nick Eckersall has just put a comment there about costs and bottom lines will need to be studied. So that's sort of going down the same route. Do you want to add to that at all? Nigel, sorry, not Nick. Nigel, do you want to please carry on?
Yeah, no, of course, Patrick, and hi to everybody. And it's the first time I've joined, so I was late joining because I was actually on the West of England same seminar.
Oh, right.
So same topics all going along in the Bristol area. But yeah, no, as you know, we have lots of London funds, and that's why I had to turn my camera off to go and chat to one of them. What we've got to be careful of is green. All as architects, we've been talking green for 20, 30 years. It's in our blood, and it's good that we're doing this. But Gloucester, we've got the same construction costs as Bristol, let's say. We have the land cost of Gloucester, which is cheaper than Bristol. But what we do in terms of development and to keep the developers being attractive and the end users is actually the returns, because when it comes to residential, obviously the sales costs aren't the same as Bristol, but the construction costs are. The land values are creeping up, as we're seeing quite quickly now, very, very quickly. When we used to snigger something was 2 or 3 million for a piece of land 2 years ago, now those bits of land are 4 million and they're secure people. So I think what we've got to be careful of and what we need local government to buy into as we move forward is how the council supports in whatever way it can. Residential is different because we've got CILs, but when we're talking about office and commercial space, how we get the council and how we get initiatives to make sure developers develop, knowing that the extra cost we've got to put into all these energy systems, which are actually, you could more than say it's not an extra cost because over the life of the building, it's a lower cost. Developers will never see it that way at the start, apart from a few developers who are in it for the portfolio over a lifespan, 40, 60 years. So I don't have the answer, but moving forward, cost is going to be the most important thing. It's about how we can get the local authority to support those developments. Being mainly in Gloucester, but the local authority is probably the biggest landowner, apart from a few others scattered around. That's my observation from bringing funds and investment funds into Gloucester. It's the bottom line cost. So, and what we don't want to do is have all that green sustainability go to places around and the city lose out. I'm not saying it will, but that's as a team, we've always got to remind ourselves, how do we make sure the city benefits? And we're not going to Stroud, and we're not going to a beautiful barn in Lydney, and we're not going to a beautiful barn in Worcester, or between Bristol and Gloucester. How do we keep the people in that beautiful scene you can see behind you, Patrick, which is the heart of the city, which has got so much repurposing to be done? And as I always say, finishing off, I say this all the time when we were building new cities in the Middle East. I say to all the sheikhs, but your existing city has all the infrastructure. It has all underneath the street. It has the sewers. It has the electrics. It has the data. Why are we gonna look outside the city centre potentially? Because there's certain landowners in the city centre might stranglehold development. We need to force them to open development, because the biggest costs is infrastructure. The infrastructure exists in the city centre, so we should repurpose city centre, which comes back to being sustainability, repurpose what we have. So there's the energy cost in terms of, as we used to call it, copper pipe was more expensive than gold a while back. So underneath our streets, why are we burying gold? If you said to anybody, would you dig up the street, put gold and put tarmac back on top, they'd laugh at you. However, the amount of cost for infrastructure beneath the street is almost like putting gold under the street because it's not seen. So what we've got to do is, I think we've got a city centre with lots of small units, ideal for startup businesses, ideal for startup commercial. All the infrastructure's there, all the roads are there. I think it's just maybe keeping focus, and rather than running into green parks, I'm sure we'll see in the next 2 years loads of designs by all the big architects for green parks around Gloucester, when we've got a beautiful brown park in the middle of Gloucester. So that's just my observation coming from the older, from a lot of my funders are saying, you've got a beautiful city here, how can we make more use of what's existing? And let's not fall into that green parks, which we've seen everywhere else in the UK. It was in a damn green park with a wind turbine in the middle of it, which breaks down after 2 weeks, So
Great. Thank you, Nigel. That was really interesting. And I think also the challenge there, isn't it, in historic cities, is how do you make a historic building sustainable? It already is, perhaps, but I mean, there's big challenges come into that, and it can so often be cheaper to go and find another site than to look at a historic building. So there's a challenge there as well. I think with the COVID scenario, somebody mentioned it on the chat earlier, we're definitely seeing people moving out of the towns and cities at the moment and looking for some of these countryside locations for business units, whether that be offices or alternative uses. So at the moment, people are being driven away from the city, but I think you're absolutely right. We've got to try and stop that if we can. So any other thoughts? Anything?
Actually, just a couple of thoughts. I mean,
thanks.
Nigel brings some very important points to the table, because we can't just embark upon this green agenda without having an eye on the cost as well. And that goes back to the point about having a uniform playing field in terms of policy. And if the government wants us to hit the carbon neutral agenda by 2050, then we have to have uniform planning policy that says to all developers across the land that you have to do these things if we're going to get green. We don't have that at the moment, so he's absolutely right that what is going to incentivize a developer to spend more cost on the building when he may not see the initial returns. So that's why I'm pleased with Stroud District Council by being ambitious about putting policies in their plan to get carbon neutral developments, to get away from fossil fuels. But whether they succeed through examination is yet to be seen, because I'm sure there'll be a number of developers who challenge that and say, well, it's not the same in Bedfordshire or Berkshire, so why should it be that here? And that's yet to be seen. However, what we did see in the last local election is that there's been a surge towards the Green Party, and we got 13 councillors on the Green Party in Stroud. We've got a plethora of them in Bristol. And that's because there's greater awareness of the climate change agenda, not because the Greens have got great economic policies, because I don't think they do, but people are now conscious that we're killing our planet slowly. And if we are going to actually stop that, then we need to have some recognition that our development world has to change as well. So the other attraction here is if we can build green and make our buildings green and have that little hook, that's going to be a USP that developers can sell to people and they will buy into. And that's happening now on the residential front. I'm just looking at the chat there. And yes, there's a lot of these things that need to now come into our development, such as car-free streets, various other things. And we need to think about that holistically so that we create the environments that our people want for the future that will support a sustainable agenda.
Thank you, Paul. Anybody, any other thoughts? Anybody else want to sort of add to this discussion? Steve, I'll come to you in a minute, Al. Steve first, Steve McPherson.
Yeah, just by way of a consistent playing field, certainly from a new build perspective, but also how we adapt existing buildings. So the government have actually, for the first time, I've been a town planner for more years than I care to remember, and we do face into sort of ad hoc applications of policy, planning committees declaring climate change emergency halfway through a debate, and suddenly the whole parameters for the development change. But through the building reg process, there is actually a significant change coming, and coming quite quick, to all new build. So by the middle of 2023, there is a 31% uplift under the Future Home Standards coming on current Part L, which is energy efficiency in new homes. And every new property built from the middle of 2023 will make that first step. Big consultation undertaken last year, and another consultation due early 2023, because by 2025, the middle of 2025, there is a expectation of a 75% improvement on current Part L building regulations. Now, for new build house builders, certainly on the volume, the large volume guys and the scale that we're building at, that is a massive change in terms of infrastructure design and in terms of the design of the houses that we're building. A lot of it, I have to say, will be very much dependent on the supply chain. The government are putting all their eggs in air source heat pumps as the way that we'll be providing hot water and heating our homes. No natural gas taken onto any site beyond the middle of 2025. So this is quite an aggressive timetable, and obviously affecting new build development. How we actually implement those changes, I mean, I know from past experience, converting old buildings to reach those energy standards is sometimes actually a lot more expensive than new build. So there are some real challenges there, but actually from a new house builder perspective, the government are putting us sort of almost front and center on the green agenda. It's got massive implications for wider issues as well about green energy, the energy distribution network in the country, primary substations on developments. The energy demands from an electricity perspective are going to absolutely skyrocket in terms of the way we get hot water and the way we heat our houses as well. So there's a massive agenda there, but it's something we are facing into already.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Elle, if you want to come in there, Pete, I'll come to you to get started in a minute, but just Elle, did you want to make comment there?
Well, I was just to highlight what they're doing in Exeter, and Emma Osmondson, think that's how you say her name. She would argue, I know if she was on the call, that if you set the standard and make it a level playing field across the region, then everyone is trying to achieve the same standards. And she says that she's achieved passive house standards for commercial and residential without any uplifting costs. I don't know how she's done it, but that's what she says is achievable. And I suppose the other thing to say, and you know, I completely understand, Steve, the challenges that a big business like Bloors, I think you said, that you face. But we're an off-site manufacturer that I work for, and we're already able to offer future home standard buildings. So I think that, you know, we've known about these problems for a while, and I think if they were adopted in the time frame that was initially proposed of being in place by 2023, then that's totally achievable, and I don't know why we're not doing it. So I think that if it was mandated, we would do it, because we're all really good problem solvers, we're engineers, and we can solve these problems. I think we're just kicking the can down the road personally, and don't see why we're not doing more sooner.
Good. Okay, thank you. Pete Barrett, can I hand over to you now to give us your thoughts on your paper and lead to some discussion?
If I may, before I introduce you, if I go back to what Ellie was saying and the conversation we've just had, as a valuer, and I'm sure you'll understand this as well, Patrick, we don't shout enough, but in a property market that works properly, adding additional cost into a development should have no issue apart from affecting the land value. And that's what we need to have, is a system where the property markets work properly, because the land value, the last part of a residual valuation, should be the thing that gets hit by increasing development value, not the increased value of the property itself. But that's also a function of planning and making sure we've got enough land supply, which I know is an issue for commercial development particularly.
Yeah, it's a good point. Very good point.
My name is Pete Barrett. I'm Group Property Manager for SGS College Group. And a large part of my job is taken up managing Gloucestershire Science and Technology Park. So for those of you who don't know, Gloucestershire Science and Technology Park is based in Berkeley, and we've taken the former nuclear laboratories here, which in a week's time will celebrate their 60th anniversary, having been built in the late 50s, early 60s. And made up of buildings here, of several 100,000 square feet of buildings from every decade from the 1950s onwards. We, over the last 5 years, have been redeveloping that into the Science and Technology Park, based around low carbon skills and technology, and also education. So one of the challenges that we've had is reusing buildings. So several of the speakers already have talked about reusing buildings, and we have seen those challenges firsthand. And there's, without the rules that Paul has mentioned being in place, and without the building regulations being in place, it's up to occupiers and landlords like ourselves to make decisions about whether to reuse buildings or whether to rebuild. And there's a double whammy at the moment with the technology that Steve's also mentioned, is the technology that is there. Government are looking at air source heat pumps, but that isn't the only game in town. And there are a plethora now of different ways that we may be heating buildings, maybe using energy systems in buildings, phase change materials, all sorts of technologies that are coming out at the same time. And they've got very little in the way of track history. So people are having to make decisions about whether to reuse buildings, not knowing what systems should go into those buildings. And that lack of information is really bewildering. You're making decisions now, if you're retrofitting a building which will last for the next 20 or 30 years, and you're being asked to fit technology with no proven track record, and is it going to be the right thing going forward? So there are people looking at that, and one of our occupiers here is Active Building Centre, and I sent out some of their information before the meeting. So this is government trying to deal with that issue. So they are funded by UKRI, money from Swansea University, to look at active buildings and what active buildings will be doing in the future, and try and give occupiers and landlords some of those answers. How will your air source heat pump work? Will it interact with the battery? How will it interact with your sustainability, with your solar panels on the roof? Is a wind turbine a good solution, depending on your energy usage? What will your energy usage be, and what will your patterns of usage be? As we've got more people working from home, but we've also changed the working patterns in buildings. So people are able to come in maybe longer hours. They might be working into the evenings, they might be working at weekends. And all those changing patterns have to fit in with the technology you're fitting into the building. And it's bewildering to know which way to go. So I'd be really interested if anyone's got any thoughts about how you do that. Architects are the obvious place to go, but do architects have enough information to provide their clients with the right energy solution. Consultants are very often selling the last piece of equipment that they fitted somewhere, or the piece of equipment that they're particularly familiar with, rather than being able to give that total range of advice over all the potential options on an energy system. Gloucestershire Police, another example here, have refurbished a building down with us, 30,000 square feet. They managed to bring in the building for about half the cost, including the purchase of the building, which it would have cost to build a new building up at Waterwells. But they had a lot of problems here. Martin Searle, the PCC, was driving it forward, but it was very difficult to get the professional team to be able to give them advice on what they should be fitting into that building in order to future-proof it in the way of battery technologies, cooling systems, heating systems, etc. And the result of that, if people don't know what to do, is they won't do anything. So if we want this change to happen, we're going to need to be able to provide people with safety and surety in that they're going to be making the right decisions about these buildings going forward. And from the college's point of view, linked into that, we've got the skills agenda. And whether we are training people now or have the right people out there who've got the skills to fit all these new technologies, because we don't know what the new technologies will be. We're not going to need gas fitters anymore. 2025, there'll be no new gas fitters, but we're still training gas fitters on traditional gas boilers because that is what there's currently demand for. If that changes over the next few years, are we going to have time to reskill all our young people, mainly because they've got their whole career ahead of them, but also existing fitters, and what they're going to be fitting? Are they going to be fitting air source heat pumps? Is everything going to be electric? Is it going to be battery related? What will they be fitting? What skills will we need going forward? And I've got lots more questions and answers in this respect, and I'd be really interested to see if anyone in the group had any thoughts about how we do that, because if we don't start addressing this, we won't do anything and we won't make any impact towards those very challenging targets that everyone's already mentioned.
Okay, great. Thanks, Pete. That puts a new dimension on the discussion this morning, doesn't it? Any comments? Nigel, do you want to pick up on the architecture point, or am I dropping you in it there?
Yeah, no, it's good because there's two analogies. One, the BBC mentioned obviously yesterday about the 2025 and internationally no gas boilers, which I think all of us would say is a great step. We all knew it was coming. But I did my own job in Bristol. We had air source heat pumps. It got rejected by the council. It was 30 social housing units in a very dense populated area in a place called Knoll West, if people know Bristol. It's got a lot of issues. It was a community-based project. And the actual planners rejected because they said the air source heat pumps will create noise. And we're like, hold on, you're the ones with the green agenda saying we have to use them. And it's now gone to appeal, and we're pulling our hair out because the planning officers have no idea about legislation. They seem to just bored out of Stone Age. And we tried saying that these air source heat pumps come with an acoustic baffle. They've been designed to be in residential areas. They're not what we used to put in buildings 20 years ago. Could not win the argument, and we've been told probably it will lose the appeal because of the acoustics of the air source heat pumps, even though we've had lots of money spent by the community on data of top professionals doing engineering, acoustic modelling, and anyway. So one is planners and councils are going to be the Achilles heel. But coming back to the question about technology, as many people know, I live in the Middle East, talked about it earlier. We brought in 20 years ago district cooling, one of the world's largest engineering companies based in the UK, sold a system of district cooling. 5 years down the line, we turned the switch on to provide power and energy and cooling to all of these beautiful buildings you see. None of it worked because they'd been sold some dud technology which was so out of date. But again, that's what all the professional consultants at this very important company based in Bristol knew what it was. Nobody knew what the future equipment was for when you turn on the button. So they'd been sold, literally Dubai was sold second-hand equipment, which didn't work. So no one's used it, no one's piped into it, and it was a £1 billion failure. SGS have hit the nail on the head. Nobody has the answer as to what is the correct technology. What is the technology coming out tomorrow? And I would say this is a new debate which could probably happen quite quickly, and I don't know where the answer lies. And it's quite scary that you're right, us as architects, we are forward thinking. We know about passive house, and Ellie's right. If you design a normal building properly, it's passive house. I've been doing buildings 20 years, which you could probably argue a passive house because they're built correctly, just correctly. If you build it correctly, it's passive. It's airtight. It works. It's energy efficient. So
if you build passive, you build a high quality building, so it
absolutely
overcomes a number of the other challenges that we're facing.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Ellie. I love that comment. So I think SGS as a university, they've hit the nail on the head really, because, and I'm sure Paul will have loads of ideas around this, but there's a big gap in what we know as architects, because we do get people selling us stuff. You're absolutely right. It's scary that we all know you try and get an electrician on the job, you cannot get an electrician on the job. If I was an investor right now, I'll be buying electrical companies, left, right and centre. I would be investing as of tomorrow in buying out any white van man company who does electrical fit out, because that is the future. It's all about electricity, getting into buildings. I don't have the answer, but I think Paul will probably have things to add as others do.
Patrick, it's the thing I need to say there, it's pioneer syndrome. And I reckon Nigel's got a load of arrows in his back from the planning officers about noise because they don't understand it. It's common across the land, Nigel, and it's a sad fact of our planning system, because we have sometimes we have planners in the development management side that have no concept other than what they see before them in a local plan and how they should then process. I've got the very same problem. We're doing a large eco settlement at the moment. And I've got the settlement to be designed so that nobody needs to travel by car. Everything is done by personal modes of transport, such as electric scooters, electric bikes, bicycles. And for longer distance journey, I have spent an inordinate amount of money and time talking to Network Rail about reconnecting the settlement to the mainline railway station. I thought I was a pioneer. I thought I was doing the world of good, until I met Gloucestershire County Council, who said, can you do a traffic assessment so that we can make sure that everybody can travel out by car? When I told them that I did not want them to travel out by car, I wanted to internalise the trips. I've got a massive development there so people don't have to travel. And if they do want to get out to Bristol or to Gloucester, they can get on the train. They said, well, that will only get a refusal from us because we want a traffic assessment to make sure that you can actually get all the cars out of there for everybody who has a car. It's the lack of vision that we have in some of our authorities. And I'll have to say that some are better than others, and that's driven by politicians. And we've got to get the politicians to actually embrace this and not just do a tick box exercise. Otherwise, we will fail. And that's the problem we currently have. So I sympathise with you, Nigel, but we've got to persist. We've got to get the technology out there, and we've got to make sure that it's attractive and it actually is what people want on the ground.
Thank you, Paul and Nigel. I mean, there's always a commercial angle on this, isn't there? Because when you say lack of vision, Paul, I mean, and also Nigel, you said if you were an investor, you'd go buying electricity companies or service companies to electricity. But of course, we don't do these things, do we? Ourselves, we don't go and buy loads of electricity companies, or we don't take the plunge and say, well, let's just go carless in this sort of remote area. So it's a human problem as much as anything, because if we are the first architect to design this carless scheme, or the first planner or planning authority to give it the go-ahead, then of course they feel they're next on the block, and it can only go wrong. So there is this default, whether it's at the design stage or the architecture or the planners, which says, actually, let's do something we're comfortable doing, because that's always worked in the past, and we can't see far enough ahead in the future. Because those projects, Paul, are 20 years away, aren't they? Or certainly 10 to 15 before these carless areas will perhaps start to kick in. Or do you think sooner?
I'm afraid it's got to happen sooner. The figures I mentioned at the beginning of this, 35% of our emissions are coming from cars at present. And, as much as people would like to hide behind the fact that we can get an electric car and reduce that emission, we've still got congestions on our road, and we do not need to travel as far as we do need to travel. If we went through the pandemic, we all survived by not traveling, and we all actually quite enjoyed that. And we've now got new platforms and forums such as this where we don't have to travel. So we do not need to travel as far as we have to. If we can get our communities designed correctly so that people can actually feel safe by travelling on personal modes of transport, then we will succeed. So carless travel is the future. 15-minute neighbourhoods will be the future, and that's what people want in the future.
Thank you. Okay. Any other comments around? Is it anybody feeling that David? And then I'll come back to you. And then I'll come to you, Ben. David.
I think the issue that we've always found with new technologies is a lack of perhaps willingness or availability of resource. So I think everybody around this table wants to see improvement and see these technologies embraced and brought into our built form. But if we haven't got a resource ready and willing to implement it at an economic level, then that to me is where these technologies have always slightly failed. We have great technology, and I think in the system building, in Ellie's world, you have control over it. I think you can very much produce very, very efficient buildings. And perhaps Steve McPherson may sort of comment from a developer's point of view. I don't know how and what they've done to try and implement new technologies, but finding the resource to actually implement them is very, very difficult, and that is consistently a logjam in the system. So it's probably training and education and a perception, really.
Thanks, David. Yeah, Ben Ramsey of Barnwood Construction. You're on mute, but that's it. Thank you, Ben.
Morning, everybody. Just a really straightforward observation, really picking up from what Paul said. In that when we first went into lockdown, the amount of cars on the road obviously reduced dramatically. Air quality improved significantly, and other than a number of sectors that obviously been decimated to a degree, the world has carried on as well, working from home and working remotely. However, over the last 2-3 weeks, it's almost back to normal, and we're almost, if we're not careful, going to lose that opportunity of reducing our time on the road. So really, just an observation on that point, really.
Thank you, Ben. That's helpful. Yeah. And anybody else before we move on to El's thoughts? Any other final comments there?
Patrick, just one final
Paul,
comment.
I'll come to you, Peter. Yeah, Paul.
Sorry, just to follow on from what Ben was saying. The other thing that we saw during the pandemic was a load of unruly, horrible cyclists all over the roads everywhere, and cycling just went through the roof. Fantastic, and that's set to continue. And we've got all these lycra clad mammals everywhere now, and it's become a popular thing. You can't get a bike in a bike shop anymore. Now, we want to see that continue, and to do that, we've got to repurpose our roads and reinvent our communities to make sure that happens. And Ben's right, we can't lose the opportunity to educate people that you don't have to travel as far as you must.
Thanks, Paul. Pete Barrett, do you want to close off there? You wanted to make a comment, but yeah, well done. Thank you.
I think we've got to realise whatever the technology goes into the building, buildings of the future, whether they're reused or new, will be more complicated than the buildings of the past. They will have different systems in them, systems we haven't got at the moment. And there is a whole piece there about who fits those, who trains those, and also how people interact with their buildings, whether they're in them longer because they're working from home, but your building might be taking heat out of one room and moving it to another room. We will have more complicated buildings in the future. And there are cybersecurity issues around that as well, because they'll be linked back to the Internet of Things. And there's going to be cost implications as well. But we're not going to have simple buildings in the future, unless Ellie tells me otherwise.
I'm just about to cover some of that, so that does.
Well done, Pete. Thank you.
Bring it really nicely around. Shall I carry on, Patrick?
Over to you. Yes, thank you.
So thanks. I'm Elle George. I'm the innovation lead for Totally Modular. And we're a volumetric housing manufacturer. We're actually based in the West Midlands, but I live in Gloucestershire. And I'm going to talk today about the potential for the digital information pathway to be a game changer that I think will help the property sector to become more sustainable. And I think that our sector is facing a bit of an inconvenient truth that without changes to our business models, we won't be able to disrupt the current path that we're on. And so I'm talking about the digital side, but I should make it clear first that I'm not a data geek. I'm an civil and environmental engineer. In fact, I only learnt from the programmers that I'm working with the other day that UI stands for user interface, because we're developing a house tracker app that I'm going to tell you about in a moment. But I think that the programmers that we're working with, they use a lot of acronyms and technical language, and something I'm constantly calling out, because I think it's a problem that someone's already touched on, that in not just our sector, as a wider society, we're not adopting these new technologies quickly enough, and the digital strategies aren't forthcoming because they're complex and people are frightened of them, and there's a lack of accessibility for non-technical people. So that said, you know, you only need to look at Airbnb for the hospitality sector, or Amazon to retail, or Uber to the personal transport sector, that construction and property aren't immune to this. Those sectors have been completely transformed by disruptive digital solutions. So can this digital transformation be a catalyst to some of the issues in terms of climate change that we're facing? And can they transform the playing field in terms of deployment of low energy, high quality and healthy buildings? That's something I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to talk about briefly just three things that we're looking at, and these are the use of house passports, the integration of smart energy networks into our buildings, I think that's already been touched upon, and thirdly, monitoring of building health. So you can see where I'm going here, that we need to have a golden thread of information, starting from the conceptual design through detailed design, through the constructions, handover, maintenance phases, and of course not forgetting the important but often overlooked element of designing for deconstruction. So yeah, I said that I'm the innovation lead for Totally Modular, and my role is to deliver against 3 Innovate UK funded programmes, and we work in partnership with a number of organisations in a consortium, and one of these is called Stella, STELLAR, so you can look that up, and we aim to develop an innovative housing model that is a focus around human-centred housing. So we're creating this app, among other things, and the House Passport app will be used to gather data on a building through its life cycle. So the idea is to literally track the home through its life, and we'll gather the data as it's manufactured, then constructed on site, and then this data is handed over to the client or the asset owner to be used in the maintenance and operation phases, and eventually decommissioning, as I said. So the tenant will benefit from understanding how their home is performing, and to help simplify the management of their home. So to give an example of how this would work, when an element is installed within the on the manufacturing assembly line in our factory, for example, the home heating system, this can only be signed off by persons with relevant skills and qualifications, so competent people, and that is defined within the app. So they're using the app to input this information, and they can record information like part numbers, store photographs of the installation to provide reassurance of the build quality and the competence of that person who's installing it. And then this information, and they call it metadata, can then be used by the asset owner, who knows exactly when and how to maintain the heating system. So you know, that metadata is used in the life of the building, and so both the asset owner and the tenant can see how it's doing. So the second innovation is around smart energy, and this is most definitely relevant to every part of the built environment and property sector, because the energy landscape in this country is completely changing, and it's from the upheaval of the national grid towards decentralised assets, and the shift to electric cars and smart cities, the 15-minute city that everyone's talking about. This is a time of unprecedented change, but of course with change comes opportunity, and smart energy is the use of data to navigate the evolving energy landscape. So the smarter infrastructure can lead to increased efficiency, new revenues, and the cleaner, greener future for our power. So what does this mean for property? Well, for our developments, we're selecting the right mix of technologies for the home, taking into account the full lifetime value of these products. So collections from the energy assets can be turned into micro energy stations to sell back to the grid. And data is used to identify individual home energy profiles, understanding the fluctuations and the dominant nodes, and they can then prioritise reducing energy consumption. And that uses techniques such as demand side response, load shifting, and then significant savings can be made. And the next 10 years are really crucial in terms of decarbonisation, and it will require unprecedented change in terms of our consumption habits and the way that the energy systems are deployed. So we need, this is crucial, we need behavioural and technological changes to achieve net zero carbon. And smart energy means energy production needs to move more local, using local energy generation, and also, of course, reducing demand in the first place. And that is a smart energy strategy. So in terms of what we're doing for our buildings that we're producing, we're installing home batteries alongside renewable technologies and low carbon heating sources. And together with the Fabric First approach, you have an A rating building that is future proofed. And thirdly, in terms of health monitoring, property health monitoring, it's taken a global health crisis to realise that our greatest wealth is health, and it's forced a spotlight on how contaminants in the air can cause health problems. But viruses are not the only potential pollutant in our home, and as people involved in property, do we put enough value on positive health outcomes from the buildings that we're spending all this time in, or do we just see these health initiatives in terms of cost? Well, in terms of cost, ill health from poor housing costs the NHS a whopping £2.5 billion a year due to respiratory and circulatory diseases. So in terms of thermal comfort, statistics show that if £1 is spent on reducing fuel poverty, 42 pence can be saved in terms of cost of the NHS, and that's in terms of less deaths, less heat-related stress and premature deaths, and also statistics show that people would be prepared to pay more for a healthier home. We spend 90% of our time indoors and 65%, probably more with COVID, of it in a home. So it's not difficult to make the connection that if you have poor buildings, it will equate to ill health. So we know that we need to build healthy homes, but we need to make sure that they remain healthy and working efficiently. So one of the other Innovate UK projects that I'm working on with Totally Modular is around an IoT, Internet of Things, that is enabled sensors for the home. And the sensors monitor things like humidity, temperature, and carbon dioxide, and this combination of readings can give a number of indications of the health of this indoor environment. So for example, one landlord had a property where the temperature in the building was only 13 degrees and the dew point was very close to 11.5, and this combination of conditions where that gap is very small can create serious condensation and lead to mold growth and very bad living conditions for the tenants. So the platform highlighted that there was a problem in this building, and the social housing landlord is highlighted to this, and they intervened and started to pay for the fuel within the property. And that cost of intervening and paying for the energy was less than the cost of the mold growing that would have occurred if there was no intervention. And just as a second example quickly, the platform showed the temperature, humidity, dew point, they're all steady average, that was all working fine, but the problem was there was massive carbon dioxide and it was off the chart, and these readings, they couldn't be understood. So the landlord visited to understand what the issue was, and it was actually 14 cats producing the very high levels of CO2. But this resulting graph and triggers could also be indicative of over-occupation by humans, so something which a housing provider would want to intervene for. And the combination of sensors allows also to identify if a property is vacant. So as well as the healthy home element, the platform monitors the other aspects like solar production, energy consumption, home battery capacity, amount sold to grid, energy imported, and the earnings, and also CO2 that's avoided. So that all links back to the smart energy ready property that I mentioned in the past. So those three things do obviously come together in terms of they're all interlinked. And now people are becoming increasingly aware of the link between the quality of housing and maintaining good health, and data can actually support us to actively manage properties that will bring social benefit. So I should just conclude by saying that digital solutions alone can't solve the climate crisis, and this notion of data equaling a divine truth does need challenging, because data only exists in the first place because humans choose to collect it, and they collect it using human-made tools. Therefore, the data is as valuable as people. But that said, we do need to believe in data, and data is necessary for us to understand the problem and to begin asking questions about the problem. And it's only through asking these questions that we find a pathway to the solution. And you know, and in anticipation of someone asking the question, and I think Pete might have already raised it, there's a huge challenge around security of data. But obviously in Gloucestershire, we're in the right place in particular to put the best minds towards ensuring that the risk from the data security is minimised as far as possible, and that cannot be a reason not to adopt it, because digital solutions are coming whether we like it or not.
Great, thanks Al. I think that obviously brings a very tangible sort of approach to how we read what we're doing, and then we start to bring some solutions in to improve our performance. So it brings some real numbers to it, doesn't it, I imagine. And any questions or observations for Elle across the room? Anybody want to make comment here?
Sorry for speaking so quickly.
Okay, well done. Pete.
Yeah, we mentioned how complicated buildings will be, and it is difficult for occupiers when buildings are complicated. We have a school here, the UTC. It's got a range of air source recovery, air source heat pumps, air recovery, underfloor heating, etc. And for a normal school to manage those systems is really difficult. You're dealing with a caretaker trying to manage complicated systems, and there's going to be a human element about it, of how we allow people in houses, older people in houses, people running schools and other businesses to be able to effectively manage what will be much more complicated building systems than they're used to. Ultimately, the solution is AI and allowing a computer to do it yourself, but we're not there yet. So there are going to be challenges around that in upskilling and training those people.
And would you use data like this, Pete? Have you started to do so, or?
Let's take the school for an example. There's a huge amount of data comes back from the BMS, but people haven't got the time to sit there and go through it and try and make sure the building is operating, efficiently and to its optimum capacity. And that will be the same across most occupiers. Is someone there to respond to that data and make those changes accordingly? And very often the case isn't.
Interesting challenge, that one as well, isn't it? Any more thoughts on this, or people who feel they could use it? I was thinking of the construction as well, really, whether or not this is something that would be useful in one or two homes within a development for the use of everybody. Is that possible to allow people to share this, just to understand if it's the same build, a home from either a previous era or new? Is it something that can be used across the board?
Well, they've IOPT, who we're working with on this digital, on this health monitoring platform, they've already deployed this monitoring to hundreds of properties in, and I'm sorry if you're Scottish, but Renfrewshire and Cornwall, and it's been very successful, and they've saved tens of thousands of pounds. So I think more, in particular, social housing providers can identify vacant properties and save on maintenance costs. So I think as more do it, and it's demonstrated that it works, I think more will adopt it. But people don't like to be the pioneers and the first ones. But it does work because it's been done already.
And that's the same for the office environment as well, Elle, is it?
Yeah, and well, in terms of offices, we've got the WELL standard. So I think we're a bit further ahead in terms of looking at health in buildings, in office buildings, and there's already standards that look at that, but we haven't got that for homes.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I've scared everyone with talking about data.
Well, you said but I think it's obviously a bit dry, isn't it, when it's data, but it's important. I mean, you put it over very well. So I think we've understood, and I think the group fully understands the importance of having this information. Quite an interesting challenge from Pete is how we then use it, or if we use it at all, is a big danger in any walk of life, really, isn't it, or any new systems.
I think but it's also people as well. And it's, if you take a house, for instance, we've got house builders on here, that increasingly, as you get a more complicated heating and energy system going forward, it depends much more on what the building's being used for. So the same house occupied by a retired couple will look very different than the same house that's occupied by a family. And traditionally, the gas boiler was able to cope with both of those. But almost you have to start speccing your solution depending on who's going to be using that building in order to make it as efficient as you can. And it also comes down to, and again, something ABC are looking at, even the orientation of a building.
Do you know what, Pete is absolutely right there. A quick classic example is where I live. My wife works from home in the front room. It's very cold, north facing. I'm in the back of the house, which is south facing. She'll come out at 5 o'clock saying, I'm so cold, and I've got all the windows and doors open because even now it's nice and warm. And I'm saying to her, open the doors at the back of the house, and open your window, you'll drag that air through. but it comes down to age. I then go up to my children's bedrooms. They have no idea how to open a bloody window. And I'm like, right, open a window, get some ventilation in, and also get the air moving. So coming to age, the generation beneath us are so linked to technology. They're probably wondering why they're not open the window for me. So the AI future monitoring of the house and BMS and community BMS systems that Siemens used to do in America, and how communities all tapping and the smart energy of the community, something we haven't touched on yet, so it's a whole different topic. I think the future generations will understand more, but you're right, our generation, the Audi generation, we live in a house completely differently. And so houses and orientation and smart systems are always going to be personal. So how will the computer pick it? I think it's really interesting. It's an unknown, and the error is the human.
Really, Nigel, wouldn't the solution be to swap rooms with your wife, though?
Don't go there. Don't go there.
If you take an example of a row of houses, imagine in the winter, you've got all the family houses, they all come on, they put the heating on first thing in the morning, everyone's toasty warm, and then everybody leaves. And that residual heat remains in those buildings when there's elderly people in fuel poverty in the houses next door, when that heat is disappearing. And that sort of approach is what we'll need in the future to say, where should we be moving this heat around to? And that all becomes from sort of joining our communities together, but it's very, very difficult. And the house builders will understand it's almost an impossible thing to do, but we sort of have to try and get our heads around it.
I do think, though, that Paul raises a really, really important practical point here, because there's an enormous amount we could be doing. My mother lives in a 3-bedroom house, and, you know, she heats the whole blooming place. And quite frankly, we have to have an attitude change to this. And she should be in a smaller premises. I shouldn't single her out, should I? But she should be in a smaller premises, because a family of 4 should live there, and they won't use any more energy than she's using. And there's a lot of practical things that we also need to be thinking about. Elle, sorry.
I was just going to say, in terms of responding to Pete, that that's where smart energy comes in, that we need to be thinking more locally, how we can use the heat locally, how we can aggregate our heat and electricity more efficiently rather than everything coming via the grid.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to ask a good question, a simple question. It came from Nick Cox a few days ago, who's with the group. Yes, he's still with us. But I'm just going to ask a simple question of the 4 on the panel in order of how they spoke earlier. So Paul first. Question is, what does the panel say is the single most important change that needs to be made to ensure property is more sustainable? So what single most important change do you think do we need? So Paul first. Quick answers, please.
Attitude change, getting everybody aligned in their thought process to ensure that we are able to address not just the quality of the building and its sustainability, but to address the climate change agenda.
Thank you. You can say the same one if you want. I'm not trying to force you to do different ones, but David.
Developers require certainty. I would seek to deliver as much of this as we possibly could through revised building regulations.
Okay. Pete? Unmute Pete. Mute Pete.
Someone had to do it.
Yes. Sorry, I missed that. Thank you, pardon.
Existing building stock.
Existing building, yeah, of course. Yeah. And Elle?
I'd say adopt a fabric first approach every time.
Fabric first. And anybody else want to answer that question? Very welcome to. Nigel.
Coming on to what some of the other panelists said earlier, we need to see, well, you said it about your mother, we need to see buildings differently. We need to see buildings as when we buy a car. When we've got a young baby, we buy a car which is safer. As we get older, we go back to a 2-seater because the kids have left home, but we started off with a 2-seater. We need to see houses, not as a place I live in for 60 years, but it's got to be a place I can adapt and change as my life changes. Because as you said, let's heat 2 rooms, because I only live in 2 rooms. Why have I got a 4-bedroom house? Oh, because the kids grew up in it. We've got to break that bond we have with bricks and mortar, which is very British and English, and see it's such a joined up thinking, isn't it? It's from electric scooters to the roof tiles we use. It's very, very exciting.
Yeah.
You know, but Paul hit so many things on the head. It's so exciting.
Attitude, isn't it? Change. Anybody else want to make comment on that or answer that question? If not, I'm mindful of time. We've got a couple of minutes. If there are any other final points anybody wants to make or questions, please do so. I'm looking across the board. It may well be a good moment really to close off, I think, and to absolutely thank everybody involved for attending. For those who've contributed, particularly the 4 panel members, thank you very much indeed. I think we've had some good discussion and we've covered a lot of areas, and I'm sure there's a lot more could be covered, but time won't allow us. But thank you very much indeed. Thank you to Jill, and hope everybody has a good day. Thank you very much indeed.